If we can get started, everybody in the back, take a seat. Good afternoon. I'm Peter Glassman. I'm a volunteer here with the Book Festival. I have a few announcements, after which I will introduce George Gibson, who will moderate our next session, Memoir, Where We Came From, Who We Came to Be. So number one, welcome to the Book Festival. Thank you for coming and for supporting this wonderful festival, this wonderful community event. So welcome and enjoy the afternoon. The Book Festival, as you do know, is free, but donations are essential to the festival's success. Survival kits, Book Festival water bottles, and great-looking Demon book bag, shown here, are all available for sale at the information tent. So please be generous as possible. If you don't need a tote, you can give cash. Food is available for sale from the Orange Peel Bakery, Mary's Lemonade, Scottish Bakehouse, Chef Dion Catering, and Chef Amy Johnson's food truck. So please support these food vendors. Be aware the authors will take succinct questions from the audience at the end of the discussion. So please, no preaching. When asking a question, please line up at the microphone in the aisle. Also stand relatively close to the microphone, about a fist away, so we can all hear you. Authors will be signing books in the book signing tent immediately following the session for about 30 minutes. Please allow them to get to the tent before engaging them. The books are available for sale in the adjacent book sales tent. Please buy authors' books. This is how we support the authors, the book festival, and independent booksellers. Plan ahead for Christmas. It's right around the corner. After the session, the 2 o'clock session is at the community center. Just a reminder, Voices of Cultural Change. The next session here at the Menemsha tent is at 3 o'clock. At this time, I'd like to introduce George Gibson, the moderator for this session. George Gibson joined Grove Atlantic as the executive editor in January 2017. Previously, he was publishing director at Bloomsbury, US, where he worked for 23 years. In this capacity, he edited and published many acclaimed works of nonfiction, including Dava Sobel's Longitude and Galileo's Daughter, Mark Kurlansky's Salt, Carol Anderson's White Range, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide, which, by the way, was featured in the 2017 Martha's Vineyard Book Festival. George began his career in the book business in 1972 as a clerk at the Old Corner Bookstore in Boston, which was then the oldest continuously running bookstore in America. It's my great pleasure to introduce George Gibson.
No applause from me. Hold it for all of these guys. Hold it for all of these guys. So they're the real stars of this panel, and that's way too much about me. But welcome to what I think was going to be a very memorable panel, and it will be memorable because of the power and the inspiration in the memories each of these authors has been willing to share with us. And they are, and so starting on the outside, just for brief introductions here so that all of you know who you're going to be hearing from. Dani Shapiro is the author of 4 previous and beautifully titled memoirs: Hourglass, Still Writing, Devotion, and Slow Motion, some of the best titles that I have seen, as well as 5 novels. Her writing, fiction, essays, journalism has appeared in The New Yorker. Mary, did you ever edit her in The New Yorker?
Don't think so.
You don't think so? All right. Granta, Elle, Vogue, The New York Times, and many more. She's taught in writing programs at Columbia, NYU, the New School and Wesleyan, and is the co-founder, and any of you aspiring writers out there may want to go to this, the Siren Land Writers Conference in Positano, Italy.
Oh my gosh, how great is that? Sign me up.
She lives in Connecticut. Many of you, no doubt, know island resident Victoria Raskin, but for those who don't, she is the daughter of the legendary actress Fay Wray and the legendary screenwriter Robert Riskin. Their memorable lives, individually and together, the subject of her compelling memoir. She adapted Willa Cather's My Antonia for television and was also a producer of Carson McCullers' The Member of the Wedding Feast. She was president of the Writers Guild of America West and served for a dozen years as a director of Human Rights Watch. Kwame Onwuachi is the executive chef at Kith and Kin and the owner of the Philly Wing Fry franchise in Washington, D.C. He was raised in New York City, Nigeria, and Louisiana, truly a unique trinity. He was first exposed to cooking by his mother in the family's apartment in the Bronx, and that spark turned to passion and led him to train at the Culinary Institute of America, to become a contestant on Top Chef, and to open 5 restaurants before turning 30. He has been named a 30 Under 30 honoree by both Zagat and Forbes. Mary Norris grew up in Cleveland, but her passion for the classics, and especially Greek, brought her east to college at Rutgers University in New Jersey. She joined the New Yorker soon out of college. Truly, the most perfect publication for someone addicted to language. And for several decades as copy editor and copy chief, she polished so many of the articles that you have read over the years in that wonderful magazine, and loved those articles without ever knowing the hand that guided them. Now you do. She is the author of the best-selling and utterly beguiling account of her years at the New Yorker, Between You and Me, and she lives in New York City. Admiral William McRaven, when Admiral William McRaven retired in 2014, he had served for 37 years, longer than anyone, as a Navy SEAL. And he had commanded at every level. As a 4-star admiral, his final assignment was as commander of all U.S. Special Operations Forces. After retiring, he served as chancellor at the University of Texas from 2015 to 2018, and he lives in Austin, Texas now, and is the author of the New York Times #1 bestseller, Make Your Bed, which persuasively argues that making your bed every day is both the act and the metaphor for getting ahead in life. Is that a fair assessment?
Fair assessment.
This panel is not quite as large as the recent Democratic debates, but an hour is barely time to introduce them to you, and I want to be sure each of you in the audience comes away with a full appreciation for the brilliance in each of their books. They are truly, truly impossible to put down. In each of them is pride and humility, humor, a big heart, and above all, honesty in their story and in their voice. So to get started, Admiral, there is a wonderful line early in your book when you recall your father, who loved to tell stories, saying to you, "Bill, it's all in how you remember it," which seems to me a wonderful description of memoir. And Dani, I'm going to start with you if I can. I know this is a bit unfair, but in the interest of time, would each of you, starting with Dani and then coming this way, spend 3 or 4 minutes introducing yourself by describing your book in your own words and what inspired you to put in the very hard work it took to craft it.
Thanks. So in May of 2016, my husband was sending away for one of those DNA tests, what I would call now recreational DNA testing. And he asked me if I wanted to do it too. And for really no reason at all, I said, sure. Something that haunts me today, because I easily could have just said, no, thanks, that's okay. When my results came back, they revealed to me that in a succession of steps, that my dad, who raised me, had not been my biological father. I've spent my life as a writer writing about family secrets. They were my themes. I teach and I'll often say to my students, theme is just a fancy literary term for obsession, and we don't choose what obsesses us. So what obsessed me was secrets, for reasons that I really understand now. There's a line in Inheritance, which is, I always knew there was a secret. What I didn't know was the secret was me. I quickly came to understand that my parents had been having trouble conceiving, that they had gone to an institute in Philadelphia where sperm was mixed, donor sperm, and the sperm of the intended father, to protect the family from ever really knowing whether the child was the father's or not. And so this all happens in the first 20 pages of my book. I come to understand that my biological father must have been a sperm donor. And it takes me 36 hours from the moment that I realized that my beloved dad who raised me hadn't been my biological father until I found my biological father, using nothing more than Google and Facebook and the internet, which is very much a story of our time. And really, the heart of the book is the unfolding for me of two mysteries. One is, what does it mean to discover that you share a parental, like a biological connection with a complete stranger? What is that relationship as it unfolds, if it does? And the other is, what did my parents know? Which took me into a deep dive into the history of reproductive medicine in this country and what was told to parents and the secrets that they were told to keep, that now, because of easy, accessible DNA testing, hundreds of thousands of people a year are discovering the truth about their identities. It's known in that industry as a non-parental event when it happens, and it's happening literally to hundreds of thousands of people. So.
Victoria.
Thank you. Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here at the book festival, and the island now is my full-time home. We moved here from Santa Barbara, which is a complicated move, but I'm now in the land where I'm used to having frizzy hair in the summer. So, so welcome, everyone. So this journey began for me kind of without the intention of writing a book, but sitting with a group of women and writing down stories and memories from childhood, as Dani has done so brilliantly over her career, and realizing that there was a part of me that was yearning for what I lost as a child, my early years, and sort of reconstructing this broken part of myself. Just to set the stage, my mother was an actress, Fay Ray. She's famous for King Kong, but I would like you to know that she starred in over 120 movies. And she was a very hardworking professional woman and quite beautiful and magical. My father was a scrappy first-generation Jewish immigrant from New York who came to Hollywood and became extremely successful in the 1930s, writing such screenplays as It Happened One Night, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, Lost Horizon, You Can't Take It With You, Lady for a Day, Meet John Doe, and set Columbia Pictures on the map and made it a successful studio and spoke to the issues of the time, which was during the Depression. We lived a magical life when I was growing up as a little girl. We had a big, beautiful home. There were lots of parties, lots of games for kids, nannies, just the whole world kind of, we felt like we were the center of a very wonderful universe living in this orbit of Hollywood royalty. One day, when I was 5 years old, the day after Christmas, my father came home from work early. He was having trouble walking and he was holding his head. He climbed the stairs with difficulty up to his bedroom. He was having a stroke from which he never recovered. He lived another 5 years, and my mother did everything she had to do to care for him. But we lost him, and we lost our beautiful life, and we lost the sense of magic. And so I was emotionally stuck there, because as a little girl, I had imagined that he wasn't in a convalescent home, but that he was on the beach in the south of France. I don't know why I picked that, but why wouldn't I, right? And I would one day be old enough to go and find him, and we would be together again, and life would be whole. Well, it never was going to be whole. And I realized how much of my life has centered around the impact of that experience in many wonderful ways, but in ways that I wasn't even aware of. And so the book goes back to that early moment. But I went back to find them. Who were they really? what were they really like? And could I know them? Not as sort of parents sitting on a pedestal, but as the real three-dimensional people that they were and the extraordinary individuals and what they contributed to the motion picture industry and to the world at that time, and of course, ultimately to my life.
Kwame.
So it's interesting the way my book came about, and a lot of people ask me, like, you know, you're 29, why do you think you can write a memoir about your life? Like, you haven't lived enough to write a memoir about your life. And I'm like, well, somebody asked me to write a memoir about my life. So when I used to give a lot of motivational speeches in the Bronx where I'm from, and for a multitude of reasons. One, because I was young enough to the high school students so they can see something that they can aspire to, and also because I looked like them and was doing something like positive with my life. And I had a catering company that I started by selling candy on the subway in New York City, and so it started with little speeches like that, and then I got invited to do this food conference called Bitten in New York City, and it was for like 600 people. It was the biggest one I did, and this one I put a PowerPoint presentation together. I was like really excited. And I just told the story of how I got to where I am, you know, my life story. And when I walked out of the room, there was a literary agent that happened to be in the crowd. And she was like, it's a really good story, you know, you should write a book. And I was like, how much is this going to cost me? And she was like, I don't get paid till you get paid. And I was like, all right, let's go. So then I wrote a proposal, and that's how it came about. But I grew up in New York City, in the Bronx. My mother's half Trinidadian, half Creole. My father's half Jamaican and half Nigerian. So I grew up with a lot of different types of food in my life. My mother was an accountant but wanted to spend more time with us. She was tired of seeing babysitters raise me and my sister. So she quit her job and started a catering company. She started a catering company from the house. So me and my sister, probably definitely against the law, became her first two employees. I was 5 and she was 10. So she would make it like a game, like, let's see who can peel the shrimp the fastest, you know, or I gotta run to the bathroom, stir this roux for me. And so, you know, I learned a lot of like technique at a very young age. And it was better than doing laundry, so I wasn't like that upset about it. But it also like sparked this level of creativity in me because I was too young to go to the events. So I was stuck home with all the mise en place, so my sister went and helped her with the events. And I would just be like a mad scientist in there, you know, trying things out. And that's where my love for food really came from. You know, and fast forward a couple years, I was 10 years old, and I was veering off in the wrong path, which is pretty easy to do. You know, in New York City, they say you grow up a lot faster than other cities, and I think it's because you're left to your own laurels a lot. You know, you have to start taking the train to get to school, and if you start hanging out with the wrong crowd on the train, that can affect your whole life trajectory, and it was. And my mother saw that, and she wanted to nip that in the bud. So she told me I was going to visit my grandfather for a couple weeks in Nigeria. Really excited. I don't know what I did to deserve this vacation. But when I got there, I quickly learned it wasn't a vacation, that I would be staying there. So school was starting in September, so I drove to a call center. It's not like we could just pick up a cell phone, you know. We had to go to an internet cafe and wait in line, and you know, we finally get there and I call her and I'm like, wow, it's September. School's starting soon. Like, I get it, you know, it wasn't a vacation, but she was like, you're not coming home until you learn respect. And so she left me there for 2 years, and I learned a lot of valuable lessons. And I'm not gonna lie to you, I did not come back a saint at all. I came back an American teenager, started getting into the same things that got set me out there in the first place. But as I got older, I started to realize the small things we have here in life, in America, that we take for granted, like water on the table or electricity. You know, we had to raise our own livestock there. We lived in a small village. So the book is, you know, the book tells a lot of little stories like that about my life, and it just shows another perspective. You know, it talks about the culinary industry as well, and how hard it is for a person of color to come up in, you know, the fine dining world. And I think you can replace the word chef for notes from a young black photographer, notes from a young black journalist, and the same narrative will remain true. maybe not getting sent to Nigeria part, but the parts of, it's tough the closer you get to the top and there are less people that look like you, the harder it is to kind of break down certain barriers. So that's what the book is about.
Wonderful.
In my eyes.
Mary.
Okay, well, I always wanted to write. And growing up in Cleveland, I would go to my room and write terrible poetry. And I thought that if I got a job at the New Yorker, I would soon be writing for Talk of the Town. And so for 35 years, I was a copy editor at the New Yorker. I was better at that than I would have been at waiting tables, though. And I learned a lot from all the writers that I worked with, and about the language and about also how to deal with writers and writing. And all that time I was writing, I wrote a novel that you've never heard of because it was never published, and I wrote a memoir that was never published, and I wrote a blog about parking your car on the street in New York City. And that had a small but faithful readership. It was not until I had tried my memoir, which was about having a transgender sibling, with another agent who turned it down, and I was on the verge, am I ever going to break through here? That somebody came to my office, somebody whose mother is here, in fact, her name was Eleanor Martin, and said, would you write about commas? Somebody has written a thing for the Times, Ben Yagoda, that makes fun of New Yorker commas, and we need to defend our commas. And I think it was, commas? Please don't make me write about commas. But in fact, one of my mentors at the New Yorker, ferocious proofreader, had made this comma shaker. It was just, can with perforated lid, and she'd wrapped it in brown paper and written comma shaker on there and drawn commas. And that had come down to me, and I had been jockeying commas around for 30 years. So I was still a writer, despite not having much of a publishing record. So I thought, well, I guess it is up to me. So I wrote this thing called In Defense of Nutty Commas. And that was on the New Yorker's website, and that is when I first started getting attention as a writer. I started by writing about other things in New Yorker style, and eventually this book came out called Between You and Me, Confessions of a Comma Queen. It took me a long time to figure out that comma queen is a play on drama queen, but we are that. And while I was writing that book, I was invited, I'd been studying Greek since the 80s. It was one of the things I did while I was on the copy desk at the New Yorker. We had this nice night shift, so we're free during the day. I started studying Greek in order to travel to Greece. I was inspired by the movie Time Bandits, where Sean Connery plays Agamemnon, and he's shown in ancient Greece dueling with a minotaur, and the scenery behind him was so simple and elemental, just land and sky, and the land had nothing on it. It wasn't green, or it was just rocky. And I took that for ancient Greece, and that's when I decided, well, I want to go there. I later found out that movie was shot in Morocco. But I started studying modern Greek, and then that led me, being in Greece for my first trip, led me to study ancient Greek when I got back. And that's when I was studying ancient Greek at the expense of the New Yorker. I had to talk them into it. They didn't think it was relevant at first, but they learned different. So while I was working on Between You and Me, I was invited, it was my 7th trip to Greece, to go on a press trip. And I knew I shouldn't take the time off from writing the book, but I couldn't resist a free trip to Greece. So while I was there, I kept notes on Greek and the alphabet, hoping to incorporate them into this book about English grammar. And of course, they all got cut. But when it was time to write a second book, my editor remembered, well, we have some things here. Would you like to write about Greek? I said, would I? I had been trying to write about Greek since I started studying it, and to write about tragedies and mythology and etymology and my Greek travels. And those travel pieces became the seeds of certain chapters of the book Greek to Me. And there are also tales from the New Yorker and trying to preach Greek to people at the New Yorker. But the main thing about this book was that I finally got to write about Greek. And it's been very satisfying. It was the thing that got me through a very rough time in my life, and I am a zealot for all things Greek.
Bill.
Yeah, thanks, George. First, let me thank the Book Festival for the invitation to be here, and I also want to thank Tom and Valerie Rosenberg, who are hosting, George Ann and I, terrific, and my good friend Bob Barnett and his wife Rita are here. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for Bob, so thanks, Bob. So the book, Sea Stories, really, I was raised by parents from the World War II generation. As I look through this crowd, I'm sure a lot of your parents were of that generation as well. And when you think about the greatest generation, these are men and women that were children of World War I, children of the Depression. All the men went off to World War II, and a lot of them stayed on and fought in the Korean War. So growing up as a young boy, this generation, they were great storytellers. And certainly as I would listen to my dad, but also my mom, they would tell these stories of heroism and courage and sacrifice. There were funny stories. There were inspiring stories. There were some stories that candidly were a little unbelievable, but they were always interesting stories. So as I grew up around this storytelling kind of culture, as I joined the SEAL teams in 1977, we were not storytellers. It was not appropriate to kind of tell what you'd been doing. So my children kind of grew up not really knowing what I had done in my career. As my father got older, I finally convinced him to tell a few more stories. And my two boys in particular, but my daughter as well, said, "We don't know a whole lot about your life. We would like to know the stories that kind of got you to where you are." So several years ago, I just kind of on the weekend started writing a few of the stories. And then after the book Make Your Bed did well, I was asked by the publisher, "Well, do you have anything else?" And I said, "Well, I have this book of stories." And I hope what people take away from the book, they are about my 37 years as a Navy SEAL. So they are, stories of the raid to get bin Laden, the rescue of Captain Phillips, the capture of Saddam Hussein, and some missions that most of the public isn't aware of. But what I hope you take away from this is it's not really about me. It is about the great young soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that I had the great honor to work with. It is told through my eyes, but they are the real heroes in this book, and rightfully should be. But it was fun. It was cathartic to write it. But I also have told folks, if you get a chance, write the story of your life, even if you never get it published. Because when you write the story of your life, you see certain events differently. You see them and how they changed the vector of your life. I tell one story about a coach that called me as I was trying to break the mile record in high school, a record nobody cared about but me. He called me one night, inspired me to run hard the next day. I ran hard the next day, broke the record in the mile, and because I broke that record, I was convinced that I could now go on to do other things. I could be a Navy SEAL. If I could set this goal and achieve this goal, I could be a Navy SEAL. And that paid off, and of course, everything about the rest of my life went on another trajectory. And so when I look back on my life, I realize that one phone call changed my life forever. And people may not have an opportunity to go get bin Laden or to rescue Captain Phillips or to get Saddam Hussein, but you will have an opportunity to make that phone call, to inspire some young man or woman to do something different, and that will change their lives. And I hope that's what you take away from this book. Thanks, George.
So I've got questions for each of you, and Dani, maybe I'll just start with you because we'll go in the same order. But yours is in many ways the most personal memoir, maybe painful in some ways. Has writing it given you what you hoped it would? I don't know if you knew what you hoped to get out of it at the start, but has it given you what you hoped it would at the end?
That's a great question. I think both writing it, Joan Didion has this wonderful essay about her writing life called Why I Write, and in it she says, She writes, even if I had even the remotest access to my own mind, I never would have become a writer. I write in order to understand what I feel, what I think, to discover, really, as the Admiral was saying, to make discoveries. In this case, I was writing to discover literally the story of my life, and I was writing it from very much the center of it, from very close to when the events happened, but it was a combination of both the writing of this book and the bringing of this book into the world in January. I've been on the road since January when the book came out, and it's the connections with so many people, readers, but people who have had discoveries of their own family secrets, and the ways in which my events have become almost gathering places for people, for late discovery adoptees and people who were adopted and didn't know, for people who are making different kinds of discoveries for all sorts of reasons. I mean, we're kind of in the era of the end of the secret in certain ways, whether it's the Me Too movement or it's DNA testing, or it's the way that there's so much that is accessible to us now, which I think ultimately is really a good thing. No doubt in my mind it's a good thing. It's also, yes, of course, a painful thing, but connection, which I think we're all so hungry for. I've been able to have this experience of really looking at people who come up to me who have tears rolling down their cheeks and saying, "You're not alone, you are so far from alone," and I'm kind of out there seeing it. So that's been enormously liberating for me. Also, simply, it's the truth. And I did an event not that long ago where during the Q&A, all the questions were handed to me on index cards, and I was shuffling through them, and one of them was, "What good is knowing?"
Oh my gosh.
And I took the question because, I mean, where do we begin with how good it is to know, ultimately, even if knowing can be hard?
Yeah. I'm holding up Victoria's book because I just want to say something about it, that it is one of the most sumptuously illustrated books of this size that I've ever seen. There are an extraordinary number of photographs that are woven through the narrative. And I want to ask you, did they all come from your parents' scrapbooks or archives?
Well,
Can you tell the story.
yeah.
Tell the story of the images a little bit, and how they amplify your story.
So they came from a variety of sources. My mother had given the family archives and photographs to USC Film Cinema Library. And so I spent several days down there combing through and finding and selecting. And then there's some photographs that are just personal family photographs. And then there are others that I found at other institutions that had a collection of cinema history. But I refused to buy any from Getty Photos. I know that's like a sacrilegious thing to say, but they charge a fortune.
No, it's
so
not sacrilegious at all.
it's like, wait a second. There's a picture of me. I have to pay for it. But I'll tell you a little story about the photographs because I collected them very carefully. And I want to say thank you to Random House and Vicki Wilson, who was my editor, and who just did a fabulous job. There's some clapping for Vicki, my goodness, who did a wonderful job of pushing me to help select these photographs. But I had them all very carefully placed for the final selections in some plastic boxes, file boxes. And we were living in Santa Barbara. And I don't know if all of you remember, there were some wildfires that came through Santa Barbara. And so I took them out, put them in my car, and when the fires passed through, I put them back in the house. And then there was an announcement we had to evacuate again, and that there was going to be perhaps some flash flooding. So I took the boxes and I put them upstairs on the second floor of our house, and went to the hotel and had a lovely dinner, and the rains came. And 3 days later, when I went back to the house was completely gone, along with all the photographs.
Wow.
So I just said I'm going to have to figure out how to recreate them and, not to be discouraged, although I was a little discouraged. I got a call 2 weeks later. The top of our house had flown on top of our neighbor's house and crushed it. And there was a crew going through the debris. And they came into the space where the upstairs was, where I had placed the photographs, and the 2 boxes were sitting there completely untouched, not a drop of mud on them. So I sort of feel like this book for me was a blessing with some blessings that came along the way.
They were clearly meant to be in this book.
Yeah. But I spent a lot of time thinking about how can I highlight this moment in history, who do I want to emphasize during the labor wars, the films my parents made, some of them from Sony Pictures, others of them from these private collections, until I felt that that you could go along and see the story as well as read it. And that was really wonderful, and I'm grateful to Vicki Wilson and Random House for loving movies and old Hollywood the way that I do.
Kwame, describe your mother's kitchen in the Bronx. I mean, it's a marvelous part of the book, and you have a gift for description. But you talk about being the inspiration for you. Describe it for everybody so that because it was a tiny place,
Yeah, it was.
and yet all of this inspiration came out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had a lot of kitchens growing up. We moved around a lot. The first kitchen, though, is a small little linoleum yellow floored kitchen that was, definitely hasn't been changed since the 70s or 60s. And there were these little indentations next to the stove. These 4 little indentations for my step stool that I would stand on next to her. There was a faux Formica countertop. A faux mica countertop. Wooden cabinets that I couldn't even reach, an old fridge, and that was pretty much, I think it was like 50 square feet, maybe, if that. And then the next one was a little bit bigger. It was more of like a hallway style. And this one I remember more vividly because, one, there was a fire escape in the kitchen that my mother would do all of her like jerk chicken or smoked wings or andouille sausage. Once she liked to break the law, clearly. So like she had, child labor going on and also smoking things off the fire escape. But it built character for sure. And there was a catering closet that was connected to it that became my bedroom. It was a small little closet because me and my sister got older. We couldn't all stay in the same room. So I stayed in the closet, but my sister and I would fight a lot. That's one of the other reasons why I got sent to Nigeria. And she would chase me around. So the closet was connected to the kitchen, and then it was also connected to the living room, and the living room connected to the kitchen. So we'd be running around this ring trying to chase each other. So that was
While your mother was cooking, no doubt.
while she was cooking normally, yeah. And there was fire going on the fire escape. It was a crazy scene.
And describe one particular dish that you remember your mother cooking.
I would have to say gumbo, seafood gumbo. It's one of the first things I learned how to make. Like I said, we would definitely take turns stirring the roux because you have to get it to this deep chocolate consistency and color without burning it. There's like a very thin line. So we would take turns. She would only use this wooden spoon that was like passed down. And she would also insist on making everything. So it started with the shrimp stock. Like that was the best part. So all of the shrimp that we would peel for the gumbo, we would use the shrimp shells to make the stock. And then she would make her house spice, which every like Creole or Cajun family has their own like house spice recipe, and she had her own. So we would have to measure all those things out. And then we would have the trinity, the bell peppers, onions, and celery that would soften in the roux after it was a perfect color. Then you would pour in the shrimp stock and let that simmer for about 3 hours. And then add in your seafood and your chicken and your andouille sausage. So we would eat that like once a year. It was a really expensive dish, and that's normally what she would make for like birthday or like Thanksgiving was the gumbo. So that's something that's very, very near and dear to my heart.
Anybody hungry out there now?
Yes.
Mary, describe the moment when your passion for Greek and Greece was ignited. Where did it come from?
Well, I'd seen this movie.
Yes, that's true.
And
Yes, Sean Connery.
I went to, that's when I decided to go to Greece. I went into work the next day. I worked for a man named Ed Stringham in the department called collating at the New Yorker. It was before the word processor, and somebody would write by hand on a fresh proof the accepted changes from about 5 different sources: the fact checker, the proofreaders, the editor-in-chief, and the author. Anyway, it was kind of a network, the center of a network at the New Yorker, and Ed was a character. He came into the office around noon, and when the work was done, he stayed in the office reading until past midnight, and he was very organized about absorbing all of world culture. He started with ancient Greek and moved to Roman and German and Icelandic Eddas, and he read everything and he remembered it. So when I told Ed I'm going to go to Greece, I think I want to go to Greece, right away he showed me on a map. We had a map of Europe on the wall where he had gone on his first trip to Greece. It was a cruise. Athens, I think it was Santorini, Crete, and Rhodes, or some of the Dodecanese. And then he pulled a book out of the shelf which was called A Modern Greek Reader for Beginners. And it was in Greek, and he started to read it and translate it. And that was, for me, a Helen Keller moment, because I had the idea, well, I'll go to Greece, I'll see Sean Connery. It had not occurred to me yet that I could learn Greek. And so Ed was my mentor there. He just, he helped me right away. We found a course in modern Greek at NYU, and I started learning the basic things you need to travel. And then I found a wonderful teacher up at Barnard named Dorothy Gregory, who taught modern Greek at Barnard and took me on as a private student. She was from Corfu. And I studied Greek for a year, modern Greek, for a year before I went to Greece. And I was able to buy a ferry ticket and buy a meal and get a room in a hotel and get in a lot of trouble. And I reached the point where I could formulate the question, but unless I got the answer I was hoping for, I didn't understand. That's, you say, then Katalava. That would be my middle name in Greek. She didn't understand. But it grew and grew, and it was that moment realizing that I could be literate in Greek. The Greek word barbarian means anyone who does not speak Greek, because anyone who didn't speak Greek they thought was just saying bar, 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 bar. That's where barbarian comes from.
Bill, there are any number of breathtaking stories in your book. You've alluded to a couple of them. And I asked you this earlier if you'd be willing to, but would you recount for everybody here the story of the parachute drop that went wrong?
Sure. Before I talk about the parachute drop, though, I think to put the chapter in context, let me go back just a little bit. When you go through SEAL training, very early on, they give you this inflatable boat, a rubber boat called an inflatable boat small, about 8 feet long, 7 guys carry it. And the first thing they're trying to teach you is teamwork. And they tell you, look, we're going to give you a simple mission. You go out through the surf zone, you paddle down a few miles, you come back in. And you find out very quickly in the SEAL teams that we're called the SEAL teams for a reason, because it really does require a team to get that boat, through the surf and down. But the other thing you realize is that I don't care if you are the biggest, the strongest, the fastest, the most talented SEAL, you can't paddle that boat by yourself. So now let me fast forward about 25 years. I've been in the SEAL teams 25 years. I am now the commander of all the SEALs on the West Coast. And we go out for a routine training parachute drop. And we take off in a C-130 cargo plane, get up to about 13,000 feet. It's a beautiful day in San Diego, not a cloud in the sky. You can see the Pacific Ocean. You can see Mexico. And what you're supposed to do is the ramp comes down in the back. Again, you're not hooked up to the airplane. It's called a free fall parachute jump. You jump off the back of the ramp. You fall from about 13,000 feet down to about 5,500 feet. You look around, nobody around, you pull your ripcord, parachute opens, and you glide nice and easily to the ground. Well, this particular day, again, beautiful day, ramp comes down, a couple guys go out, I look around, I jump out, I get stable, so you tend to flop a little bit, I get stable, so I'm falling, and I look off to my left, and there's 2 guys below me over here, and then there's 1 guy off here to my right. Well, I'm kind of watching this guy because he's starting to drift underneath me, and that's never a good thing. But as I'm watching this guy, he's starting, and all of a sudden this guy's underneath me. And I look at my altimeter, and it's too late. He opens his parachute, and in relative terms, I'm moving at 120 miles an hour, and he has stopped. So I hit his parachute, and it's much like, I'm assuming, getting hit by an airbag. So it hits me, kind of stuns me, and spins me out of control. And now I'm falling about 120 miles an hour towards the ground, and frankly, I'm not exactly sure what's happened. I realize I'm stunned. What I should have done is gotten stable, but instead I reach for my ripcord, and I pull my ripcord. Well, the parachute, there's a pilot chute that pulls the main chute out. And because I was tumbling, the pilot chute comes out and wraps around one leg. The riser, another part of the parachute, comes out and wraps around the other leg. And so now I am kind of completely entangled in my parachute, falling towards the ground, thinking to myself, yeah, this doesn't look too good. But as I'm kind of fiddling with the parachute, trying to get it open, the good news is it opens. The bad news is it blossoms very quickly and cracks me in 2.
Oh my God.
And so it split my pelvis by 5 inches, pulled all the muscles out of my back, my stomach, fractured a little bit of my back, and the parachute was inverted. And then I end up landing about 2 miles from the drop zone. But the point I try to make in the chapter is not so much about the parachute drop and my injuries, because frankly, they pale in comparison to what I saw after 9/11, the young men and women that were hit in Iraq and Afghanistan. This was really just a scratch. But the point I try to make is, in order for me to kind of literally get back up on my feet, I went back to the lesson of the little rubber boat. It took a whole lot of people to get me back up and running. My wife, Georgianne, became my nurse. Guys came by and took care of me. My Admiral made sure I was able to stay in the Navy. It really was about the fact that if you're going to get through life, we're all going to have tough moments. You really need to make as many friends as you can, have the goodwill of strangers and colleagues, because you can't paddle that boat by yourself.
Right,
And that was the lesson of the parachute drop.
I promise you, if you read his book, that story comes up, you will not stop. It will not seem as if you've seen it or you've heard it before. You will want to read it again. We have 10 minutes for questions. So if anyone has any questions, if you could come up to the microphones here. Anybody want to be the first? Somebody's got to be the first. Please.
So I'll confess, I'm trying to write memoir. How do you decide what to leave out?
Anybody take it? Anybody
Get a
wanna-
good editor. Make someone else do it.
I think that's the art of memoir. Really, is what belongs. I don't remember whether it was Annie Dillard or Annie Lamott. So sorry to both Annies, but who said, you may not let it rip. And Vivian Gornick has this fantastic phrase, which is that writing memoir is about thinking about what will be of interest to the disinterested reader. It doesn't all belong. And I think the process really is this kind of winnowing of what it's. Ultimately, I feel that writing memoir often gets misunderstood as kind of somehow being solipsistic or really sort of internal, when in fact, it's the act of transcending your own life so you can see it.
Anybody else want to add to that?
Well, I just think you have to be honest, probe yourself, stay focused on what matters, and then you have to make sometimes difficult decisions, because you may be writing about people in your family or in your life. And how do you want to describe them? Do you want to write about them? How will they feel? And be respectful to your journey, but also to those you love. Because I think sometimes people, I just think you have to be respectful to yourself. Yeah.
Kwame, do you want to add anything to that?
I was just gonna say, just leave out the boring stuff. Nobody wants to read about that, But also, there are some interesting stuff that you have to leave out too, because it just doesn't flow.
Yeah.
And you just can't write everything, or else it'll just be like diarrhea of the mouth, you know. And it needs to like make sense chronologically. But if you start with leaving out the boring stuff, I think that's a good start.
Bill?
Yeah, I would just offer you, and I was a sailor for 37 years. There's a lot of stories I didn't tell.
Yeah. Right.
They just weren't appropriate for mixed company. But I also think, to one of the earlier panelists' comments, I mean, I made a point of trying not to embarrass or degrade anyone because, frankly, you know, we all make mistakes in life. I work for some great folks, and I work for some knuckleheads. The knuckleheads aren't in the book because I wanted the great folks to be recognized for the work they did.
Could you tell us how you connected with your literary agent?
Well, I have several stories since I've had several agents, which are a little bit like spouses. You know, breakups are not, you know, are not easy. I mean, my story, just very briefly, is because I did everything wrong. Is I was in graduate school. I had written a first novel. A friend of mine looked at a photograph in a magazine of two very high-powered literary agents and said, "This one looks like she's been in psychoanalysis. She will understand your work." So based on that great research, this is basically a story in like do the opposite of everything I'm telling you. I picked up the phone and called this woman, which is not what you do, and I somehow got through to her, and she said, "What's your book about?" And I spat out a couple of things, and she said, I'd like to read it, and I dropped it off at her office that afternoon. And the next day she called me and she said she wanted to represent me, and she did represent me for the next 10 years. However, I did no research. And I think that in the light of retrospect, that was a mistake. She actually wasn't the right agent for me. But I was so grateful. I was so incredibly thankful that somebody was taking me on. That it was a little bit like, you know, oh, like I don't have to pay you. Okay, you're gonna, you know. So yeah.
Anyone else want to add a story?
I don't know. It's just thinking affectionately about my friend Robert Bernstein. If any of you remember him, he was head of Random House, chairman of the board for years. Right, beloved character. And we had been connected through my work on human rights, and we were having lunch. And if you knew Bob, he was an effervescent, amazing, outgoing personality. We disagreed on human rights issues, but I loved him anyway. And he said, "What are you up to?" And I told him about the book, and he said, "My son should represent that. I'm calling Peter right away." And he picked up the phone and he said, "Peter, I have your new book." And nobody would dare say no to Bob. And so you just didn't want to ever let him down, right? Yeah. So it was pretty easy. It was just a lunch. And he picked up the tab.
Well, let me, before I want to just add one because it's a terribly embarrassing admission here, but I want to admit it anyway. So when I retired from the military, first advice I got was get a good lawyer, get a good accountant. And I said, "Well, do you know a good lawyer?" And they said, "Well, we know this guy named Bob Barnett in Washington, D.C. He's a pretty good lawyer. You know, maybe he can help you out." And when I went to the University of Texas, Bob helped negotiate my contract. Well, about 3 years later, I decided I'm going to write this little book. But I don't know anything about the book business, so I called up Bob. I said, "Do you know anybody that knows anything about books?" A little bit of a pause on the other end of the line. He says, "Yeah, I know." I said, "Yeah, but I'm looking for somebody that really knows the business." He said, "Yeah, maybe I can help you." And for those of you who don't know, Bob is one of the giants in the industry, and I just didn't know that. But I do now, Bob, so thank you.
Please.
Hi, can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for your insight into your work and your new career. Admiral McRaven, thank you and your troops for your dedication and service.
Thanks.
I do make my bed every day since the speech because it really provided me a bit of an anchor during a rough patch. So my question to you, in your new career as a writer, your career in the military, you had a lot of discipline every day. In your career as a writer, do you spend a dedicated number of hours per day writing, even if you don't have a project? And this goes for all of you who are writers or secondary career writers.
Yeah, you know, in my case, I'd like to tell you that I'm disciplined enough to get up and kind of have a writing routine, but that is not the case. But I had dinner with a couple of Pulitzer Prize writers a couple of months ago and asked them that question. And the really good writers do, in fact, I mean, they were telling me they write 6 or 7 days a week. Candidly, I'm lucky if I get a couple hours in a week. That is not the way to write, because I think you lose the flow. I had to go back when I was writing Sea Stories because I wrote it piece by piece over many, many years. Every time I'd sit down, and I'd go months without writing, I'd sit down and go, okay, where the hell did I leave off here? I mean, that is not the way to write. So I think better addressed to the people that are professional writers here than I was fortunate to kind of get it done.
Dani?
Well, it's funny, the whole make your bed metaphor, because one of the things I also say to my students is there are two kinds of people in the world: people who get up in the morning and make their beds, and people who would twitch if they left the house with their bed unmade, and then people who don't feel that way at all. And it was a metaphor actually for writing, because it's like sort of, in a way, methodical, neat writers and sort of messier writing, not on a schedule, different times of day, just different ways of, I think so much about the writing life is coming to know yourself in terms of what your habits are. I'm a make your bed person. I did have a student who said, I make my bed in hotels. I was like, you win. But I am a make your bed person, which I think really relates to writing. When I'm working on a book, I need to touch it every day. I need to start the day writing. If I don't, and early on, my friends and other people didn't understand, like, why can't you have breakfast? Why can't you meet for lunch? Why can't you take my call at 11 in the morning? And over time, I really understood why I couldn't, because if I did, it would ruin my writing day unless I got what I think of as a foothold in the morning. And then if I get that toehold first thing, then I can come back to it later in the day, and it is there for me, and it doesn't feel like a stranger to me.
There's one more thing that at least I found helpful, and that is to end your day with something where you're excited to come back the next morning and pick it up again. Because if you just leave the day where you're stuck and frustrated too often, it's hard to pick it up the next day. But if you have a little cliffhanger in your own psyche where you say, I want to get back to this, I can't wait, I think that really helps keep you on the train moving forward.
Kwame, Mary, any thoughts?
Well, I was just going to say that writing is a good way to get a lot of other stuff done. There's this procrastination has different levels, and some of them can be very productive and make you feel like you've done something. But when I was working at The New Yorker, and I did write the first book while I was working full time, David Remnick, the editor, came in after, they were all very happy for me that I got a book contract. But he said, congratulations, you're not quitting. You'll do it the way the rest of us do. David Remnick runs a magazine and writes books and wins prizes. And he told me, you get up, this is the secret, you get up at 5 in the morning. And in my case, I would get up at 5 in the morning and I would putter around until about 9 o'clock, and then I would write. And I would get into work late. We didn't have to be there till 10, and I would stroll in at about 11:30. But I couldn't do anything at the office because I find that the headspace or whatever it is you need to do something creative, it's like, does anyone scuba dive? You have to go down to whatever, it's not an altitude, but a depth, and get used to being there and stay there for a while in order to get anything done. And then rise slowly.
It reminds me of the saying that a writer is someone who sits down at their desk and then hopes the phone rings.
Right. Or makes a phone call.
Right.
Kwame, you want to have the last word?
On writing? I worked with a co-writer, so my experience is very different. We talked a lot, like every single day. And when I would write pieces, I would just be blurting them out. And it would come to me, I would write it on my phone, on the notes, in the middle of the night. It was just whenever I felt that spark of inspiration, that's when I would write. So it wasn't really a time thing or a discipline of I need to do this every day. It was just, if I need to do it, I'm just going to do it. And when it comes to me, it comes to me.
Do you make your bed in the morning?
I do not make my bed.
Thank you so much.
I think we could all agree we could keep this going for another hour very happily, but we can't. So please.
Thank you.
So, thank you, panelists. Thank you, George, and thank you all for coming. The next session is at the community center, beginning now. So, thank you all for coming.